Welcome back. In this video, you're going to style the Hangman application using the theme that I've set up. There are going to be a few steps to get this done. The first thing we're going to do is grab and explore the CSS theme. I'll show you where you can find that in just a moment. Then once we have the theme code inside of our CSS file, we're going to need to make some changes to the HTML file. If the CSS file sets up a class for warning, we have to actually use that class for the styles to be applied. So we'll be making some small structural changes to the HTML file as well. The last thing we'll end up doing is modifying one of our JavaScript files to conform to the setup that the theme expects. So let's go ahead and kick this off by grabbing the theme code and exploring it to see at a high level what it does. Over inside of the browser, you can find this by heading over to links.mead.io, that is /Hangman. Right here, what do we get? We get redirected over to github.com, and down below we have the CSS file for the Hangman app. All we're going to do on this site is just grab all of the lines of code. So I'm going to highlight everything from the 1st to the 58th. We're going to copy those, and then over inside of our CSS file in the Hangman directory, we're going to paste it. First, delete all of the other rules that we set up just to experiment with CSS. Now, if we go ahead and save things, we can head over to the browser where we have the Hangman app, and we can see that while things are different, they don't exactly look good. Clearly, some of the styles were applied, but it's also clear that this couldn't possibly be the final styling I imagined. And you're right. While we do have some of the rules applying, many of the most important ones are not. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can improve this structure. The first thing that we're going to do is a change to index.html. Inside of here, what we're going to do is take these three elements, our two paragraphs and our button, and we're going to put them inside of a div element. Visual Studio Code has Emmet support built in. This is a shorthand for creating tags inside of your editor. You can also install Emmet for other editors that don't have it built in. That's EMMET. If I type div and hit tab, I can see that it automatically generates the opening and closing div tags. If I undo that and change that to a P and hit tab, I can see it automatically generates a P tag. So with Emmet, we just have a shortcut for creating our markup. So right here, that's div followed by the tab key. Then I'm going to take the paragraphs as well as that button. I'm going to cut them all out, paste them up above, and properly indent them. Once again, by selecting all lines and using the tab key. And this is the first change we're going to make. If I save index.html, we can head over to the browser and see what happens. This time around, we can see that things are stacked from top to bottom, which we do want, as opposed from being stacked left to right. So let's explore exactly why this is happening, and we're going to start over in the styles.css file. The CSS file starts with some generic selectors, things that aren't targeting classes or IDs. These are just tag selectors like HTML, body, span, and the universal selector. The first 9 lines just override browser defaults. So all browsers have their own set of defaults, and all we're doing here is we're trying to start from a unified place. So our styles that we apply actually look standardized. If browsers start off with various spacing sizes, each browser being a bit different, I'm never going to get my user interface to look the same. So all we're doing here is we're starting from a nice clean slate. Down below, what's correctly centering things has to do with our body selector. The body selector sets up quite a few rule definitions down below. We set the background color and the color to white like we've seen, and I also customize the font family and the font size. It's the last 4 lines that are a bit more interesting. Using CSS Flexbox, we're able to center the element inside of body. Here, we are making it a single div, which is why we have our centered content. The content inside of there stacks as we normally do by default, which is top to bottom. That's what we saw when we didn't have any styles applied. Now, back inside of the HTML file, I want to focus on the stuff inside of that div. The first paragraph, we're going to leave alone for the moment. We'll talk about how we're going to change that in just a second. The second paragraph is going to stay exactly as it currently is, minus the class. So all we're going to do is remove the warning class, which we had set up in the last video, to experiment with CSS selectors and CSS rules. So we don't need a class for either of those paragraphs. Down below, we have our reset button. The reset button is indeed going to have a class, but that class is not going to be warning, which actually does not exist anywhere over in the theme. The class that we're going to use is called button. If we save the file and head over to the browser, we can see that now, instead of getting the browser rendering the button using its default, we are getting styles to define what the button looks like. Here we have no border, we have nice white text on a dark purple background, and when I hover over it, we can see the background gets a little bit darker. All of the rules that allow us to style the button like so live over in the theme. If we scroll down to the bottom, we're looking for a selector for that button class, and it lives right here. Here we had defined quite a few rules to get the button to look like what it currently looks like. We set the background color to this purple. Here we're using the hex code for that purple, and we can see that Visual Studio Code is giving us an easy way to customize it. Then what do? We clear the border and we set a border just on the bottom. So we can see there is a subtle dark purple border at the bottom of this button. After that, we customize the font color as well as the cursor. So we change the cursor from the default, which you're seeing here, over to the pointer, which we're seeing currently. Next up in our rules list, we customize the font size and the font weight. That's the font thickness to make things a little smaller and a little skinnier. And then finally, we set up some padding, putting a bit of space between the text and the edge of the button. The last thing we do is define the transition, and the transition is what allows us to smoothly switch between the lighter purple and the darker purple. So you can see it fades in as opposed to just jumping from one to the other. So all of those rules together allow us to customize this button. When we're using the theme, all we have to do is attach this class to the button to inherit all of these rules. Now that we have this in place, we want to focus on the first thing right here. That is the puzzle. Currently, the puzzle is just a paragraph. We dump a bunch of text inside of it, and we show that text to the screen. This creates a puzzle game that's actually pretty hard to use. Currently, it's pretty obvious that there are two words, both about the same length, but if I start making some guesses, because of the poor formatting, it quickly becomes difficult to see exactly how many letters I have where and how many words I'm working with. There are styles inside of the theme that make this a whole lot nicer to view. The only thing we have to do is modify our markup and a little bit of JavaScript to conform to them. What we're going to end up doing is converting this over to a div. So right here, we're going to have the opening div tag, and over here, we're going to have the closing div tag, and then we're going to add a class onto this div. A class, and the class is going to equal puzzle, which is the only other class selector we have over in styles.css. The puzzle selector defines a couple of rules down below. The second rule just puts a bit of spacing between the bottom of the paragraph, this paragraph, well, I guess now it's a div, and the next thing. So that's going to give us a little space right in here. Currently, they're jammed up against one another. And that first rule, once again, uses flexbox, which we saw up above. And all this is going to do is stack things from left to right, which we want for our word. Now, this is important because what we're going to do is actually add a new element to the DOM for each individual letter. That's going to allow us to properly size and space things, keeping it uniform and making the puzzle way easier to actually solve. So here we can see we do have our spacing in place. Now let's go ahead and customize some JavaScript code. The only file we're going to need to change is app.js. And the only part of app.js we're going to change is the render function right here on line 11. The first line of this function adds the text content into the puzzle element, which is currently why we're seeing it showing up right here. Instead of doing that though, what we're going to start with is actually clearing the element. What we're going to do is store HTML inside of it. So we can clear all HTML inside of puzzle element using inner HTML. We then set this equal to, in our case, an empty string to clear it. If I did want to set some HTML, I could provide it in this string. For example, I could set up an h1 with the text test. I can then close the h1 tag. And if I were to save the program right here in the browser, we get test showing up in a big h1. The goal here is to not add any HTML using a string. We're just going to go ahead and clear it. So we set inner HTML equal to an empty string. Down below, this is where we are going to manipulate what actually goes inside of the puzzle element. And this is going to be your challenge for the video. There are 2 steps towards getting this done, and they're all things that we've done before, unrelated to working or knowing the details of CSS. The big picture goal for this challenge is to generate a whole bunch of elements using the DOM and render them into Puzzle-L. That is going to actually show some stuff inside of the browser. If I were to save the file in its current state, we're clearing all of the HTML so nothing actually shows up. By adding elements into Puzzle-L after we clear it, we'll get some content to show up. What you're going to do is create a new span element for each character in the puzzle. So imagine that I read the puzzle, game1.puzzle, and I get a string like the following back. I get the first word with no letters guessed, then a space to separate the 2 words, then maybe there's a few guessed letters, and then a couple more unguessed letters. In this case, I would expect to see 8 span elements added to Puzzle-L since there are 8 characters. We don't care what the character is, whether it's an asterisk, a letter, or a space. We want to make sure that it shows up. The text content for each of these span tags is just going to be the individual character. So this would be the text content for the first span tag. Over here, we have the text content for the 5th span tag. Once you add all of these span tags into Puzzle Element, you're good to go. You can go ahead and check out the browser and you should see some new styles applied. So to get this done correctly, you're going to have to remember what we talked about related to converting strings to arrays or arrays to strings, and you're also going to have to use some sort of looping mechanism to do something for each character. Take some time to knock this one out. Feel free to use any past videos or online resources. When you're done, test your work. If you do add those spans, you'll see the new styles. If you can't quite get it, that's okay too. We're going to go through it in just a moment. Pause the video. When you're done, click play. How'd you do? Let's go ahead and kick things off by getting the puzzle. That is game1.puzzle. And we want to do something for each character. So I'm going to use split to convert my string into an array of strings, where each string in the array is the individual letter. So I'll pass in an empty string. Now that we have our array of individual characters, we can use something like for each to do something for each character. I'm going to pass to for each my callback function, and inside of here, we know we're going to get access to the individual array item. In this case, we have an array of letters, so we could call the individual item a letter. Down below, we can now create the span, set its text content, and render it. The first thing we're going to do is create that span. I can call this one a letter element, setting an equal to, and we'll call document.createElement to create our element. Let's go ahead and spell it correctly, of course. And we're going to pass to it the element name. In this case, it was a span. Now, down below the creation of our span, we're going to configure it by setting letter element dot text content equal to just whatever the individual letter is. We don't care what it is. We're just passing it through. Down below, the last thing we have to do is render it in Puzzle Element. So puzzle element dot append child. We are going to append the letter element. Perfect. And there we go. That's all we have to do to complete this challenge. And if you did complete it correctly, whether you used this code or some slightly similar code that worked a little bit differently, if you do save the file, you should see some changes. Over in the browser, what are we getting? We're getting our characters. They are monospaced, meaning that each character takes up the same width. We can see that the space character is now way more obvious in this context. And if I make some guesses, it's still very clear exactly what's going on. The puzzle game with these styles in place is now way more usable than it was before. It would actually be a fun game to play as opposed to a really big chore. Not just a chore, but also an ugly chore, the worst kind of chore. If we head over to the CSS file, we can actually see where the rules for this one live. Over here, we have our span selector, and down below that, we have about maybe 10 different rules. We have all sorts of interesting rules. We set up the border on the bottom. That's what gives us this light gray line down below. We also set a fixed width and a fixed height to make sure everything shows up nice and uniform. We have width down here. We have height up above. We We also have font size and line height, as well as text align center to create a uniform font size, centering things under the line that lives below them. And all of this comes together to create something really nice. Now, as I mentioned already, the goal of this section is to not learn the ins and outs of CSS, which would take about just as much time as it takes to learn JavaScript. There are a lot of rules and different tools you can use to customize the look and feel of a website. If you are interested in learning more, I recommend you do so. There are a ton of great standalone CSS courses available on Udemy. I would definitely recommend checking one of those out. That's going to allow you to completely customize the styles for new projects you work on with JavaScript, and you'll also be able to customize the styles and look and feel of the applications we've created in this one. Now, in this video, we grabbed our theme and we made a few changes to the JavaScript file and the HTML file to get things working correctly. There is just one small last tweak I want to make to wrap this video up, and that is what lives inside of head. Inside of head, what we're going to do is set up a title. The title is what shows up in the browser tab. We can see that for other pages, we have a nice title with an icon. We can do the same thing for our page. Right inside of head, we can create title. This is an opening and closing tag. And what goes inside of here is the text that shows up in the tab. So I could type Hangman, for example. I can then go ahead and save the file. And what we see over in the browser is indeed the Hangman text. We can also set up that little icon. Now, I've provided the icon to you via the zip for this lecture. So if I go ahead and pull that up, right here, I have the download zip for this lecture. If you crack that open and go into the Hangman folder, there's a new images directory with the favicon.png file. That's the little icon we're going to show in the browser tab. All we need to do is take this folder. I'm going to copy it to the clipboard. Then we're going to move over to our application directory on the desktop, and I am going to paste it in. So now we have an images folder in our project, and we should be able to see that over in Visual Studio Code as well. If you do have the images folder showing up with the PNG inside of it, all you need to do to actually use that image is to set up another link right here. So we're going to create a second link. This time though, instead of linking a style sheet, we're going to link our icon. We will still be setting up an href to point to the image location. That's /images to go into that new directory, then /favicon.png, also known as the favicon. Right here, we set up the relationship still, but this time the relationship is not a style sheet. It's what's known as an icon. So if we go ahead and save the HTML file with this one line in place, we should see that icon showing up. And right here, we now have that purple circle icon for our tab. And there we go. That is where we're going to stop for this one. We now have our Hangman game in place. And in the next couple of videos, we're going to focus on getting the theme set up for the other application. The application that's coming up is the Notes app. So let's go ahead and dive right into that.